Drives Deforestation and What Stops It, organized by World Wildlife Fund's Forest and Climate Program. Thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Breen Burns, and I'm a manager for Learning and Communications. Our presenter today is Jonah Busch, a research fellow at the Center for Global Development. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping tips and reminders. Today's presentation is being recorded, and you can access the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To find the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate, or go to panda.org/forest and climate and look for the REDD learning section. There are two audio options. You can listen via your computer speakers, which we had some trouble getting set up on our end today, or dial in through the number that was provided in your registration email. It is important to note that if you have audio difficulties while listening via your computer speakers, this can be caused by having multiple software applications open, so feel free to close some of your browser windows, which usually solves the issue, or you're always welcome to join via phone. Questions are absolutely welcome. Please submit your questions for Jonah through the toolbar on your screen, and we will answer as many as possible during our allotted time. After the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email to the place on reddcommunity.org, where you can access a PDF copy of this presentation and a link to the recording of the session. So thanks again for joining us, and with that, we will get started, and I will turn it over to Jonah. So thanks, Jonah. Go ahead.
Thanks, Breen. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. This is the webinar on what drives deforestation and what stops it. Well, I'll skip past a few of the initial slides because we're running behind schedule. So, this is the outline, and then there's more information about my organization, Center for Global Development, that you can find on the web. Let's start on the next slide, please. Back one slide, please. Okay. So what I'll be presenting today is research by myself and my colleague Kalifi Ferretti-Gallon. This is available online as a working paper. It's available as a policy brief. There's a previous webcast about this work, and all the data that has gone into it is publicly available as well. It's currently in peer review at an academic journal, and will also be coming out as part of a chapter in a forthcoming book called Why Forests, Why Now, with Francis Seymour and myself. And you can see many generous funders at the bottom. All right, so just to start from the ending, and just to give you a preview of what our key findings are, we after surveying more than 100 papers on what drives deforestation and what stops it, the four approaches that stand out as the most promising are these. First, planning road networks to minimize intrusion into remote forested areas. Second, targeting protected areas to regions where forests face high threat. Third, tying support for rural incomes to maintenance of standing forest with payments for ecosystem services. And fourth, insulating forest areas from demand for agricultural commodities. I'll talk as we go along about some other approaches that are commonly put forward for reducing deforestation, like reducing poverty or increasing land rights, where we don't see as clear a signal from the data for reducing deforestation. And at the end of the talk also, I'll discuss the implications for our findings for REDD, the International Performance-Based Payments for Reducing Emissions from Forest Loss that rich countries have pledged to deliver finance for. So I hope everyone has seen the excellent paper that came out at the end of last year in Science on the state of the world's deforestation. The world is losing on net about 125,000 square kilometers of forest per year, more than it's gaining. and that's an area of forest about the size of Greece or Mississippi each year. The majority of that is in the tropics, and the pace of tropical forest loss is actually accelerating. So why is this a problem? Well, forests provide all sorts of goods and services to people, both locally and in other parts of the world. Some of the most prominent, at least 10% of greenhouse gas emissions are from forests. If you look at the gross emissions, it's probably closer to 20%. About 2/3 of all terrestrial species live in tropical forests. So deforestation causes habitat loss, leading to extinctions. And forests provide a range of ecosystem services, such as clean water, clean air, and others. And for all of these services, there are UN conventions. There's the UN Convention on Climate Change, on biological diversity, on combating desertification. And of course, there's a lot of activity to protect the public benefits of forests going on outside the UN as well in individual countries, but by non-governmental organizations like WWF, by companies committed to greening their supply chains, etc. And for all of these activities, it's important to have an understanding of what's actually driving deforestation and what policies can effectively stop it. So different authors have tried to categorize drivers of deforestation differently. For the purposes of this talk, we're referring to drivers of deforestation as factors that influence people's decisions to convert forests to another land use. And this includes biophysical characteristics of land, like slope and elevation. It includes aspects of the built environment, like roads and cities. It includes market demand for commodities, and the main commodities driving deforestation, as you know, are soy and beef, mostly in Latin America, palm oil and wood products, mostly in Asia, and charcoal and wood fuel, mostly in Africa. It will also look at household or community characteristics and governance regimes. So all these different types of factors play into somebody's decision either to keep a forest standing or to cut and burn it down for another use of the land. So about this question, what drives deforestation and what stops it, there's different ways researchers have tried to answer this, from very detailed case studies in individual locations to worldwide cross-country analyses. We're looking at one particular method, study method, that's a spatially explicit econometric study. So in this type of study, researchers have overlaid spatial information on the pattern of deforestation with spatial data layers on potential driver variables and covariates, and then performed a statistical analysis that takes into account multiple potential driver variables to see what their effects are on deforestation, whether that effect is correlated with higher deforestation, correlated with lower deforestation, or not correlated, while accounting for all the other driver variables in the model. And you can see just one example here, this example from Ecuador, where these researchers have maps of deforestation in different periods and then have matched that up with some independent variables like education and poverty and population and roads. This type of study has grown rapidly in the last couple decades. The main reasons why, I would say, are three. One is data availability. All of this spatial data is becoming, there's more of it and it's becoming more available. The statistical programs that you need to run to do these types of analysis are also becoming cheaper and easier and more widely available and used. And in 2005, REDD started, so Global Program to Reduce Emissions from Deforestation under an international climate regime has really spurred interest in what drives deforestation and what stops it. And so you can see the growth over time from 1996, where we identified the first type of this study, to nearly the present. So even though there has been more than 100 of these individual analyses, there is not yet a meta-analysis. And so why do one? Why do we think it's important to do a meta-analysis? Well, it's not reasonable to ask people to go and look at all 100 of those studies if they want to find out what's causing deforestation. We did it, but it's not something we'd want to ask other people to repeat. It took us a long time. There are several very good literature reviews that give good synthetic summaries of what drives deforestation and what stops it. But literature reviews alone cannot, they're not quantitative. They can't compare the relative influence of different drivers quantitatively. And even when they're done by extremely good researchers, they're open to the possibility of selection bias or confirmation bias in the studies, that the researchers may unwittingly not find the types of studies that don't go along with what they're looking for. Sometimes the individual studies say different things, so we need to be able to reconcile seemingly contradictory findings. We want to put forward general conclusions, and we want to identify in our work understudied topics so that future researchers can really zoom in on researching the things that we don't already know and want to know. With this work, we also want to suggest to policymakers effective policies for stopping deforestation. And for future researchers, we want to make all of the studies easily available, and we want to make all of our data available and transparent as we have on the web. So just a little bit about how we created our database that leads to our findings. We had a keyword search for subjects like deforestation or causes or spatial or regression. And we looked at the literature, and once we found studies, we'd look at their literature reviews to see the other papers that they'd found on the topic. And we ended up with about 220 papers that we thought might be good candidates. And then we systematically applied these inclusion criteria so that we were only using papers that met all 5 of these findings. So the article had to have been published in a peer-reviewed academic journal. We didn't take working papers or book chapters and so forth. The dependent variable had to be a measure of forest cover or forest change. So just papers about the expansion of agriculture or the expansion of urban areas didn't make the cut if they weren't saying how much of that was from forests. The dependent variable had to be remotely sensed. So if it was just surveys of asking people how much forest is on their land, that didn't make the cut. There had to be a table that listed the outputs from these 2 multivariate statistical techniques, either regression or matching. And at least one of the independent variables had to be anthropogenic. So this had to be describing a process of deforestation that at least in part is caused by humans and is not just totally the result of certain ecological landscapes where shifting vegetation cover is part of that natural landscape. And we ended up with 117 studies. I wouldn't expect you to read them all here, but I would like to say if you think that we're missing one, if you're interested in this and you say, you know, I wrote a study in 2009 and I don't see it here, or you know, I know of someone who did and you're missing it, please do send those our way, and we'd like to include it. And we'd like to be updating this database as well, so if something is published in 2014 or 2015 that meets the criteria, we'd like to update the study, including that paper. The database is populated with papers from quite a few different disciplines. This spatially explicit econometrics is developed within the field of economics, but that's only about a quarter of our studies that were published in economics journals. About half were in environmental science journals. Most of the remainder in geography journals, with a small minority in development or policy and management journals. And something very important to keep in mind is that all of these studies, they're not randomly distributed around the globe. They're in fact, there are 6 countries that make up more than half of our 117 component studies. So, you know, a lot of what we're saying is weighted toward Mexico, Brazil, Costa Rica, Thailand, Indonesia, China. And I think that the reason that these have been studied so heavily to date is because this is where the data has been available to date. These countries have invested in producing forest cover change data, and so this type of analysis is available. But now that forest cover change data is available worldwide, you know, from that Hansen article that I showed earlier, I expect that the evidence base will start to broaden. So just another slide or two before I get to our findings. You know, in those 117 studies, there were more than 500 analyses. They included more than 1,000 unique variables, independent variables, and you know, 5,600 coefficients. Now, what we did was we categorized each of those explanatory variables into one of about 40 metavariables. So if we were looking at altitude, there might be one study that mentioned altitude as an independent variable, another included elevation, another included lands above 500 meters, etc. And so we had to code all of those, categorize them into one metavariable related to elevation. And sometimes this involved inverting the sign. So you might have one study that had as an independent variable lands above 500 meters and another that included a variable called lands below 500 meters. And so we would have to flip one of those to make sure that in every case our explanatory variable, we were looking at the relationship between the variable and deforestation. And so if you're familiar with regression analyses, you know that the outputs that it gives are whether the relationship between every independent variable and the dependent variable of deforestation is positively correlated, negatively correlated, or not significant, conditional on on all the other independent variables. And what we do for this study is we just add them up. We add up how many times was one of the variables in each metavariable found to be positive, you know, correlated with deforestation, how many times negatively correlated with deforestation, and not significant. And what I'll be showing in the findings is the ratio between positively correlated and negatively correlated. Just a few caveats. These are all in the paper, so you know, we can talk more about them later if we have time. I won't go over all of them. But just important to note, we're not, you know, I mean, be careful to say association rather than causation in most cases. I'll talk about when we can infer causation and when we can't. None of these studies really look across countries. They're all just within countries. There are a number of things that do affect deforestation that aren't in this study because they're not mapped. So political freedoms or corruption, etc. If there's a hypothesis about these, we really can't look at it in this study because there aren't maps of those things. And there's some variables for which there are maps, but they just haven't been included very many times. So something like law enforcement or gender are, there's increasing interest, but our sample size is just quite small to talk about those. And then there's some other, dangers with meta-analyses that we've tried to avoid, and I can come back if we have time at the end and talk about how we've done that. So without further ado, on to our findings. And this is the chart we'll be looking at for most of the rest of the talk, looking at different parts of it one at a time. How we interpret these are the meta variables as I described. These are very commonly used driver factors that have gone into the component studies, and we just counted how many times each of these factors was either correlated with less deforestation or more deforestation or not significant. And what we're seeing here is the ratio between the number of times we found a correlation with less deforestation and number of times with more deforestation. So at the top, for example, no, please stay on the last slide, thanks. So at the top, for example, protected areas, there were 6-to-1 ratio of finding less deforestation and more deforestation. For every one time we found protected areas had more deforestation there were 6 times when it was less. And at the other extreme, agricultural price, for every one time we found that higher agricultural price led to less deforestation, there were 9 times we found it led to more deforestation. And these are just the 20 most heavily included of the meta variables. So there's others like law enforcement or payment for ecosystem services that showed something quite clearly, but we're not one of the top 20, and so they're not on this chart. All right, next slide, please. Thanks. So running through what drives deforestation and what stops it, let's start with the biophysical variables. It's really quite clear from looking at these variables that they do have a strong effect on deforestation. Places that are higher elevation have less deforestation. Places that are steeper slope have less deforestation. Places that have more suitable soil have more deforestation. And these are quite robust findings. Why is this? It's because lower transportation costs to get to market, it's getting ahead of myself. It's about greater accessibility to the land. It's about less clearing cost, and it's about better productivity. So more profit potential from clearing for other uses. And unlike some of the later variables, we really can infer causality here. Higher elevation is actually causing less deforestation. The reason we can say that is because we're not concerned about reverse causality here. There's no way that deforestation is causing the elevation to go up or down. And we're not concerned about simultaneous effects. So there's not something else that's causing both deforestation to go down and elevation to go up. So these biophysical variables are causing deforestation to be higher in some places than in others. Next, let's look at built infrastructure. Access is driving deforestation. So you can see at the bottom, the closer a forest is to an urban area, the closer it is to a road, the closer it is to cleared land, the more often and the more likely it is to be deforested. And the proximity to water here is not significant. So maybe, in some cases a river might be giving better access, but there may be other lands that are just happen to be close to water, and that has nothing to do with how easy it is to access the lands. Are these effects causal or not? I would say that in the case of big roads and big cities, yes, we can say big highways are causing deforestation. They're basically exogenous. They're going in there regardless of the situation in the forest. But when it comes to very tiny local roads, we can't say that small local roads are causing deforestation, because they're probably just happening at the same time as deforestation, and you could make an equally good case that the deforestation and the desire to deforest in that place is driving the small access roads to go in. Next up, we can look at agriculture. Agriculture has a very clear effect on deforestation. It's probably the strongest signal of any of the meta variables. Higher agricultural price leads to more deforestation. So does proximity to existing agriculture and agricultural activity. This really should be no surprise, because as I mentioned, the majority of deforestation, this is sort of the whole point of deforestation in the majority of cases. We know that in the majority of cases, deforestation is happening in order to put in agriculture. And so it might be a little bit surprising then to look at the effect of timber, where the effect on deforestation is much weaker and in fact not significant. And it's certainly true that in many cases people are accessing the forest in order to clear the forest to get timber, and it's certainly well documented that the access roads going in to clear timber or to log can then lead to wholesale clearing later for deforestation. But there's maybe two reasons why the effect of logging and timber is not as clear as agriculture. One is because giving access for timber might be giving people incentives to forestall much more rapid conversion for agriculture. The other is that in many cases timber includes replanting as well. So there's incentive not only to clear existing forests but also to plant new forests. Now I have an asterisk here because there's two very important caveats to this. One is when you're talking about forests replanted for timber, they're often very different than the forests that were cleared. They might be plantation monoculture of fast-growing eucalyptus or acacia, not the same as a biodiverse forest with hundreds of tree species. And the other caveat is that the deforestation as measured in these 117 studies may not and probably isn't picking up small-scale degradation, little cuts in the forest here and there. It's probably only picking up the big, massive conversion. So, I'll just take a step back to mention that when we were categorizing variables as deforestation or as these different independent variables, we just took whatever our individual component studies had said at face value. So if they called it deforestation, we called it deforestation. And if they called it community management, so did we. We didn't go back and try to second guess any of the studies. All right, population and deforestation. You can see there's a very strong correlation here that places with greater population experience greater deforestation. And the question here is this strong association causal? So there is some reason to think that population causes deforestation. So the more people there are in an area, the more labor supply there is to clear forests. and the more local demand there is for agricultural products. However, on the other hand, population increase is often just going on at the very same time as other rural expansion policies. So it might be that a road and a relocation program is causing both the deforestation and the population increase. And it might be that the deforestation is causing the population to go up. So if you have land that's cleared, it's easier for more people to come in and settle. So there's a relationship here, but it's not. But if you look at which comes first, the chicken or the egg, it's not necessarily clear that population comes first. In fact, we didn't find any studies that tried to disentangle this loop. I also want to take another little time out and step back here to say that if you've picked up this week's edition of The Economist, this research is featured in it, which I was thrilled about. But on the other hand, they completely misattributed something to this paper that we didn't say. And so since we're among friends here, I'd like to clear the air a little bit. The Economist article seems to attribute to our paper a claim that falling birth rates in China and Brazil and the Congo have led to lower deforestation in those countries. That's not a claim that we test or make in this paper. So I'm not sure where they got that from, but it's not us. Okay, now what stops deforestation? What policies stop deforestation? Let's start with protected areas. So protected areas have been very well studied in our sample, and there's really no contest at this point. More protected areas have lower deforestation. This is for two reasons, and so a lot of the literature has been trying to untangle how much of the fact that protected areas have less deforestation has to do with the protection itself, the law and the act that legally protects the area, and how much has to do with the location of the protected areas. So protected areas are more often in geographically remote and hard to access locations. How much does that account for the fact that protected areas have low deforestation? But it's a little bit of both, but for both of those reasons, protected areas do stop deforestation. You'll also see currently in the last few years a debate in the literature about whether deforestation is better stopped by so-called strict protected areas that limit most economic uses versus multiple use protected areas that allow certain economic activities. The short answer is they both do, based on the evidence that we have here, but they're going in different places. The strict areas often in the more remote places, and the multiple use protected areas where there's more people, and it's tough to really compare them head to head. Few people have done that. Here's where I'd like to mention that law enforcement is also very strongly on the top, would fit in on the top part of this chart. It's associated with less deforestation far more often than more deforestation, but there aren't that many studies yet that look at it, so it's not in our top 20 here. So all right, let's get into some controversial ones. You'll hear often claims made like making land tenure more secure, increasing the strength of communities' rights to forests leads to less deforestation. Now we didn't find that in our study, and why might that be? Well, probably because there's two effects working at cross purposes here. So on the one hand, insecure tenure rights leads people or communities to clear more quickly than they otherwise might in order to assert ownership, to assert that they're productively using the land, and to reduce the risk that the land could be expropriated by someone else. But on the other hand, if you have secure property rights, you're more likely to invest in that land, and that investment can include farming or logging. So does this mean that community forestry or more secure land tenure doesn't work? No, that's not what it means. It means that it's in some places it's working, in some places it's not working, and so a good research agenda is trying to figure out why it's working in the places where it does and whether those are factors that can be translated elsewhere. I want to mention one exception here, which is indigenous peoples. That should have been highlighted. I forgot to highlight it there, but you can see it. It's the fourth one down. With indigenous peoples, we do see less deforestation. Here's another, you know, what would you call it? It's another theory that's commonly put out there. Increased income leading to less deforestation. The theory here is the environmental Kuznets curve, thinking that poor people are the ones clearing forests, and as they get richer, eventually they'll lose interest in profiting from forests or from agriculture. This is not borne out in our finding. You know, the conventional wisdom from several decades ago may have been that tropical forest was due to deforestation was due to slash and burn, subsistence farming. If this was true then, it's certainly no longer the case. Deforestation is done by the relatively rich. So the more access you have to resources, the more you can afford to buy the inputs to deforestation, the more deforestation happens. Now with poverty, just comparing poverty and deforestation alone, it's very difficult to draw a causal link because, again, there's all sorts of issues with reverse causality and with you know, simultaneous things going on that could be leading both to income going up and deforestation going up. But fortunately, for sort of cracking this chicken and egg problem a little bit, we can look at rural income support programs where the idea has been to raise income, often independently of what happens to the forest. And here, as there's programs to support rural income, deforestation is going up as well. So what's the message from this? Well, back please. Back, thanks. So we certainly all want people everywhere to become richer, you know, regardless of what that means for forests. But it means that as the anti-poverty programs are rolled out, you know, and as there's all sorts of things done to make people richer and have better lives, forest protection policies should be put in place as well. So it's not the case that just making people richer will protect forests. In fact, it looks like the reverse is true. I put an asterisk here as well. The exception here is payment for ecosystem services. So here, the idea is to make people richer by protecting the forests, that payments are made either from governments or from downstream hydroelectric utilities to people upstream for keeping their forests there. These do appear to work, although there aren't as many studies that look at payments as there are for these top 20. So again, that's not shown on this chart. So just to reiterate the takeaway messages, the things that really look like promising approaches to stop deforestation. One is to plan road networks in a way that minimizes intrusion into remote forest areas. Another is to target protected areas to regions where forests face higher threat. Third is to tie support for rural incomes directly to the maintenance of forest with payments for ecosystem services. And fourth is insulating forested areas from demand for agricultural commodities. So the frontier areas are hearing the market signal loud and clear that conversion to agriculture is profitable. But anything that sort of puts noise-canceling headphones over that signal will be beneficial for forests, like the zero deforestation supply chain commitments that are happening in waves these days. There's some other agendas that are, of course, very good for other reasons, for social reasons, like poverty reduction and local land rights. And these are great for those reasons, but our research doesn't show that it's a win-win with forest conservation automatically, at least not consistently. And finally, I would mention that probably the most important thing that can happen to stop deforestation is overarching. It's at the global level. It applies to many countries, which is that rich countries should deliver on their pledges that they've made in the climate agreements to finance international performance-based payments for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. We need to see orders of magnitude more finance coming in behind REDD+. So with that, I'll just show the links again to where you can see the papers that went into this presentation, and to advertise that we have a book coming out. This is one chapter of a book called Why Forests, Why Now, authored by Francis Seymour and me by Center for Global Development, and just a few of the other selected papers that would be part of that. The overall global state of REDD finance currently, the quantifying the contribution of global commodity markets to emissions from deforestation, a review of the value of forest ecosystem services to developing countries, and about 20 others. So stay tuned for that. So thank you very much. Thank you to Breen and WWF. Thank you to everyone who was patient with the technical difficulties at the beginning, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, Jonah. That was a great presentation. And again, to reiterate, thank you for the patience with the technical difficulties at the beginning. So at this point, we'll open it up for some questions. So please use the question section of your toolbar, and we will answer as many as we can fit into our time today. So to kick us off, Jonah, the first question we have is from Pablo, and Pablo asks, your paper proposes policies that insulate the forest frontier from the price effect of demand for agricultural commodities. Can you give some examples of what they would be?
Sure. Thank you, Pablo. So what we found in the paper was a very strong link between higher prices, higher agricultural activity, and more deforestation. So that's what we can, based on the paper, we can say if you can break that link from higher prices to deforestation, you probably will get less deforestation. So when I mention the things that can do that, these aren't really based on, these aren't things that we have evidence on the paper that they work individually, more that they would work collectively if they can break that link. So as you probably know, there are many efforts right now by companies all along the commodity supply chain to green their supply chain, to get deforestation out of it, meaning that they're committing not to purchase soy or beef or palm oil that's come from deforested lands. So that's helpful. There's, there have been over the years certification schemes that have attempted to put a price premium on commodities that have either come sustainably from the forest or that have not hurt the forest. It would be another webinar, I think, to dive into whether those have worked. There are and I guess I would say, so in Brazil also there was an effort to cut off credit to jurisdictions, to municipalities where the soy was driving deforestation. So this is the category, the family of interventions that I'm talking about here.
Thank you. And we have a ton of great questions. So the next question is from Christopher, and Christopher says, terrific study, but close to 3/4 of the studies are from Latin America. Have you run these graphics for Latin America and non-Latin American countries separately? You have a big enough sample to do this, and as you said, drivers in Africa and maybe Asia are different. So can you speak to that?
Yes. So thanks, Christopher. So we have done that. So if you look in the paper, we're going to disaggregate these findings in a number of different ways. One of them, as you've suggested, is to look at Latin America versus Asia versus Africa. We did that, and we actually did not find cases that leapt out at us where we were seeing really contradictory or opposing findings from one continent to another. You can look in the paper and see that. Some of the other ways we disaggregated, we disaggregated by journal. We thought, maybe there'd be a disconnect between what economics journals and environmental science journals were finding. We disaggregated. Let's see. We looked at the we looked at the study level. So we were worried that perhaps some studies just put forth many more findings, and we didn't want to be overweighted towards those studies. And you can see all those results in the paper. To me, one of the most interesting ways that we disaggregated had to do with selection bias. We were concerned, as anyone who runs a meta-analysis would be concerned, that that we'd have some selection bias or publication bias in our underlying studies, meaning that that places, particular topics, especially if they're controversial topics, might be more likely to be published if they're showing one finding than the opposite finding, and that would skew, that would skew the results. And so what we did was we broke down the studies. We categorized whether for each meta variable, whether it was the focus of interest of the study or whether it was just in there as a control variable. So there could have been one study that's really interested with what's the effect of roads on deforestation, and it just happens to put stronger land tenure in there as a control variable. And there may be another study that's really interested in the effect of stronger land tenure, and roads just happen to be in there as a control variable. So we looked at the difference between studies where a particular variable was their variable of interest versus where it was just in as a control. And in most cases, the findings went the same way, but there were four of the variables where they went different ways, and so where we question whether there might be selection bias at work. These are land tenure, community forest management, poverty, and rural income support. So if you looked at all the studies that were studying poverty, the ones studying poverty said poverty is associated with more deforestation. But then if you looked at all the other studies that were putting in the exact same types of variables but were studying different things, they found the opposite by a much larger margin, that in fact it was the richer places with more deforestation. So all of that's in the paper, and I invite you to take a look at it.
Thank you, Jonah. And as you answer the next one, I'll flip back to the slide with the links to the paper. So Julie asks, can you elaborate on indigenous peoples as a variable? Does it mean that those lands are being inhabited by indigenous peoples, or is it something more specific, such as managed by and without tenure conflict?
Sure, and you can flip back to the one with the tenure that should also have indigenous peoples. this one. Thanks. Great. Oops. There we go. Thank you. So great question. What does this indigenous peoples meta-variable represent? This includes two somewhat different types of variables. The first are indigenous territories, where indigenous people actually have legally recognized rights to the forest. And this is lumped together with just indigenous populations, where there's a higher percentage of population that's indigenous, whether or not they have rights to the land. And in both cases, they're very clearly more indigenous peoples or more indigenous rights is associated with less deforestation. So based on that, what can we say about whether strengthening the rights of the indigenous people, the legal rights to the land, stops deforestation or not? Surprisingly, we don't have very much evidence on this topic. There was only one of our studies that was actually able to see a change over time in the legal recognition of rights to land. That was from Brazil, and they actually found no change, probably because there was so little deforestation before and so little deforestation afterwards. So I would call that a research frontier to actually try to prove that the greater legal recognition for indigenous peoples makes deforestation slower than it even already is in those areas. Other research, and well, let's see. So, and I wrote a blog on this recently too. So if you look at the Center for Global Development webpage, and you can find the blog that I wrote a couple weeks ago on this topic. Other research frontiers coming out of this, I would say priorities are to expand the geographical evidence base beyond Latin America to get more studies, especially from Africa, and also from the boreal regions where a lot of forest clearing is happening. And this is now possible with the Hansen data and others like it. We also now have something we didn't have before, thanks to the Hansen data, which is a sense on an annual basis of when deforestation is happening. Most of our studies are looking at decadal cross-sections or 5-year cross-sections. Not very good for saying what's the time trajectory of deforestation. I see that as an area of future research. I expect there will be more research, there'll be more data coming down the pike on forest degradation, and so figuring out determinants of degradation and whether those are different than determinants of deforestation should be an important research priority. There's still far too few causal studies that try to break the chicken and egg problem with deforestation and population or deforestation and poverty, so those are always welcome. And then I would say it's worth future researchers looking at some of the understudied topics like law enforcement, payments for ecosystem services, mining, gender, and commodity certification.
Thank you. So our next question, and Jonah, I'll say maybe we'll do a few more questions, but I do know we started a little bit late, but so we're a little over time. So let's say 2 more. So this one is from Sally, and Sally asks, did you differentiate between industrial plantation style agriculture and subsistence agriculture and analyze countries or areas where there is more extractive industry activity and infrastructure development, such as roads, bridges, dams, etc.?
Let's see. The short answer is no. Some of these studies would have disaggregated between industrial agriculture and smallholder agriculture in different places. We lumped it all together as agriculture, and I haven't looked at whether there's different findings for industrial versus subsistence. But let me plug our database for a minute. We've not only are we publishing the results of these findings, we're making all of our data and all of our coding publicly available on the website in Excel format that anyone can easily download and look at. So you can certainly, you can double check our work and see whether you would have coded things the same way we did. But you can also very easily query our database. And so for a question like this, let's say you want to do research on differences between industrial and smallholder agriculture. We've made it very easy. We have keywords. You can look up agriculture and you can pull up all of the studies that went into our meta-analysis, and then you could use that as a jumping off point for your analysis of the topic. So I encourage people to do that as well.
Great, thank you. And we'll do this as our final question. So this final question is from Alexander, and Alexander asks, can you please clarify how tenure security was defined in this study, considering that this is a subjectively defined concept, unlike proximity or price? Did the variable include lands held by individuals, corporations, and communities, indigenous and non-indigenous? Can you reflect on how this may impact your conclusions?
Yeah, good question. Thanks. So with land tenure security, this includes both individuals and communities, and companies too, I suppose. We were including in this meta variable variables that had to do with stronger legal rights to the land, just all manner of variables saying that you could be assured that the rights were yours and you had access to use it and keep other people out and so forth. We were also looking at length, duration of tenure. So the longer people had been occupying, or holding or owning land as an indicator of land tenure security. So those are all lumped together. It's possible that, and we haven't tried splitting those out into their components where you get down to fewer and fewer studies to work with. So I invite you to do that, I guess, as well. Take a look at the database and see if you think it's differently. But again, what do these gray ones in the middle mean? Looking at timber, at community forestry, at land tenure. The takeaway is not these don't have any effect on deforestation. I think the takeaway is they may have very large effects on stopping deforestation in some places, but they may have equally large effects on accelerating deforestation in other places. So it'd be very good research to figure out why they're stopping deforestation in some places and not in others. So with that, I guess I'll, thanks to everyone again. I'm happy to take more questions by email or by Twitter. And please have a look at the papers. There's a lot more information in there that I didn't get to. And I hope everyone will look forward to when this comes out as part of this book, Why Forests, Why Now, next year.
Well, thank you to Jonah. And again, here's a final list of the publications and all of these resources. And in the email follow-up that you'll receive from GoToWebinar, there's also a link on REDD Community to a page that has these. They're clickable, so you will be able to find them easily. And again, thank you to Jonah. Here are a few additional WWF REDD resources, and there are many ways to stay connected with us and with Jonah. So with that, I will bring us to a close. Thank you to Jonah, and we will see you at our next learning session. Thanks for joining us today.